World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars, the last war ever fought. Did it work out? Not quite that much.
But in the process, it completely changed the world that we live in. Our medicine, our weapons, our diplomacy, even nose jobs. World War II gets all the attention from scholars today, but in many ways, World War I was more significant.
We're going to see why.
Don't know much about history. Don't know much biology.
By the spring of 1918, it was clear that World War I could not go on much longer. Something decisive was in the offing. Germany was suffering a lot from the naval blockade by Britain. People were eating cabbage and rutabagas and close to starving.
But then, Germany had finally defeated Russia after it went through its own communist revolution. I have another video about that. But let's just note in passing that communism, one of the great ideologies of the 20th century, was one of the many legacies of World War I.
So Germany was finally able to bring all of its troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front to attack the British and the French one last time. But then, America had entered the war, and by 1918, quite a few American troops were starting to get in. So it was clear that the war would end fairly quickly.
Either the Germans could bring in their troops from the Eastern Front quickly enough and deal that knockout blow by finally concentrating all their men on a single front, or the British and French could hold out for just a few more months, survive that one last German offensive, and then win the war with the help of tanks and American troops.
As it happened, it was the French, British, Italian, and American side that prevailed, so that by November 11th of 1918, at the 11th hour of the morning, a ceasefire was proclaimed, something we celebrate every year with Armistice Day all around the world.
Which new weapons do we owe to this conflict? The ones that dominate the sea, the air, and land today. The submarine, the airplane, and the tank. Other World War I innovations were less enduring, such as the use of chemical weapons, which were banned after the war and have seldom been used ever since. But even this ban was significant. The idea that all was not fair in war, that was pioneered by the Geneva Conventions, now became part of the fabric of international law. Disarmament conferences, such as the one held in Washington, D.C. right after World War I, were another innovation of the war.
How do you make sure that this would be, though, the war to end all wars? People had thought about all of that, especially US President Woodrow Wilson, who had issued the 14 points during the war. This document is all about not just what America wanted to get from the war, but what it wanted to get for the entire world. Woodrow Wilson was a rather idealistic figure. Idealistic to the point of being a bit self-righteous. I don't care for him that much, but at least he meant well. Think of him as Miss America. What does he want? World peace. And the way to get it, in his mind, was to create a new diplomacy that was based on the concept of self-determination. Self-determination simply means that you decide what your future is going to be through a vote. It was all very democratic. So how do we decide whether Alsace ought to be French or German? Do we fight a war over that? No, it's violent, it's not democratic. Anyway, you settle it for that one war, and then 20 years from now, France will want to fight back, or Germany will want to fight back. That will never end. Instead, just organize a referendum of self-determination. French, German, independent, we don't know. Let's just ask them. That's a peaceful way to solve disputes once and for all.
And a way to solve that in the long run will be through the League of Nations, the ancestor to our United Nations today. World War I is not just the reason why we have a UN today. It also led to the very concept of collective security. The idea that war is only legal in self-defense and that great powers should be bound by international law. A complete reversal of the law of the strong that had dominated diplomacy since the dawn of man.
The armistice of November 11th only was a ceasefire. After that, Woodrow Wilson came to Paris in person, and he met with Georges Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France, and Lord George, the Prime Minister of Britain, and they spent quite a few months negotiating what became known as the Treaty of Versailles, signed in that palace in June of 1919. The treaty is generally considered a bit harsh towards Germany, but after all, Germany had lost, and if Germany had won, they had planned to be pretty harsh towards the other side. So what is in that treaty? The French were pretty clear about it. They fought for what? They fought for Alsace. And so that's what they got. as part of the treaty. And Germany also had to lose some land to Belgium and to Denmark in the north and to Poland in the east. The French also were mad at the Germans for having destroyed quite a bit of the French nation in the northeast, flooding mines, destroying industries, and they were convinced that the Germans will have to pay what is called reparations. The Treaty of Versailles specified that Germany would have to pay all the costs of the war. What was the cost? Nobody knew. The bill was enormous. The accountants had not yet tallied the bill. The Germans simply had to sign a blank check stating that they would have to pay whatever the cost of the war was.
The Versailles Treaty, by imposing heavy reparations, created an unstable international financial system that eventually imploded in 1929 when US banks repatriated all their loans from Europe, one of the key causes of the Great Depression.
As for the British, what is it they wanted at World War I? To destroy the German Navy, and that's what they got. As part of the peace treaty, Germany had to promise not to have an army larger than 100,000 men, no general staff, no large cannon, no powerful air force, and no navy able to go on the high seas. So the German high seas fleet of dreadnoughts, developed at such a high cost by Kaiser Wilhelm II, was flown all the way to Scapa Flow in Scotland, where they finally did something quite useful. They scuttled themselves all the way to the bottom. And if you're into scuba diving, I highly recommend going to Scapa Flow. You have a nice set of old World War I dreadnoughts.
Fun fact, to make some very sensitive measuring devices like Geiger counters, you need steel that has not been contaminated by nuclear radiation. However, in the 1950s and 60s, there were so many tests of nuclear bombs worldwide that the atmosphere became contaminated, and still is to some extent today. Because the manufacture of steel requires oxygen from that atmosphere, all the steel manufactured today after the nuclear test contain a tiny amount of radionuclides. So how do you find clean, non-radioactive steel? Well, in Scapa Flow, of course. You simply mine old German battleships made of steel produced prior to World War I.
Germany had hoped that by winning World War I, it would be able to steal some colonies from France and from Britain. Germany lost World War I and lost whatever colonies they had. In the Pacific, a number of them went to New Zealand or Australia or Japan, and in Africa, whatever they had went to the British or the French or to British dominions. So Togo and Cameroon went to France, and Namibia and Tanzania, directly or indirectly, went to Britain. So in that way, World War I is what I call the last hurrah for colonial empires, in that it enlarged even further those colonial empires that France and Britain had. Are the people of Cameroon or Togo ever consulted as to whether they want to be French? Is there a referendum of self-determination? None of that. It's still the heyday of colonialism. Black people are transferred from one colonial power to the other without being consulted. Why the last hurrah then? Because this empire became so large as to be unmanageable. When France and Britain emerged from World War I, they were absolutely bled dry. The French lost about 1.5 million men, the British lost about 1 million men, a whole generation wiped out. The treasuries were empty, and most importantly, those two nations no longer had faith in the future and in themselves. And so that kind of a confident cockiness that was a hallmark of the colonizers before World War I, that was gone.
This is evident in the rise of art movements like abstract art and Dadaism, movements that are based on trauma and the absurd, rather than confidence in the superiority of Western civilization. France and Britain paid such a high cost for victory that they never recovered. In the 19th century, those two countries had dominated the world of maritime commerce, culture, finance, colonial empires. By the time World War II was over, they had become middling powers. Meanwhile, US, very much a minor power on the world stage in 1914, had embarked on what would become the American century.
And so the French and the British, even though they got even more colonies than they ever had by taking those from Germany, they can't really handle those many colonies after the war. At the very same time that those colonies are now equipped with a powerful new idea, that of self-determination, that maybe they should have a say in what gets done in the future, especially since they themselves had contributed so much to the victory by sending troops from India or Senegal or Algeria to fight and die in the trenches of World War I.
Wilson's 14 points, a concept of self-determination, and the experiences of World War I led directly to the great wave of decolonization that set two continents free in the 1950s. The most obvious legacy of the Versailles Treaty was how it embittered Germany, leading directly to the 20th century's other great catastrophe, World War II. The main culprit for that later war was a young messenger who saw his first combat in World War I. His name was Adolf Hitler. Italy, as though it was one of the victors of World War I, thought that it gained too little at the peace table at Versailles to justify the rivers of blood its people had shed in the war. So ultimately, another World War I veteran launched fascism, which, along with communism, became one of the great scourges of the 20th century. His name was Benito Mussolini. Ireland was born as a result of World War I. Poland, too. With the abdication of the German Kaiser, Germany became a republic, a system that, aside from the interlude of the Third Reich, it has maintained ever since. The Russia of the Tsars, the Germany of the Kaiser, they were not the only empires toppled by the war. The ancient Austro-Hungarian Empire, where the war had begun, was destroyed by that war. In its place are the countries we now know today: Hungary, Austria, the Czech Republic, Slovakia. The Ottoman Empire, dating back to the 13th century, was the fourth empire destroyed by World War I. Its dismantlement at the Treaty of Versailles, which I covered in another video, led to the creation of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and ultimately Israel. Much of the map of the Middle East as we know it today is a product of World War I. Not all was bad in World War I. This was the first war to be waged in the modern era of Louis Pasteur and Marie Curie, with anesthetics and X-rays and clean medicine. So by some accounts, it was the first war where more people died in combat than because of disease. As long that is, as you exclude the great influenza epidemic of 1918, which killed eventually 50 to 100 million people worldwide. And because it was introduced by US soldiers fighting in Europe in 1918, in a way, these were indirect casualties of the war. Another medical consequence of the war, plastic surgery. It came into being as a way to reconstruct the broken bodies of World War I veterans. Les gueules cassées, as they are known in France. Men without legs, or arms, or faces, that had to be stitched back together into some semblance of normalcy once peace came in 1918. Plastic surgery is yet another way in which World War I is the precursor of our world.
So World War I can go by many names. The Great War, World War I, the war to end all wars, or the last hurrah for empires.
It was also the suicide of Europe and the birth of the world that we live in. You can also call it the Great Cinema War because it gave rise to a lot of great movies. A few of my personal favorites: All Quiet on the Western Front, about the war in Germany; Hell's Angels, about the air war; Black and White in Color, about the war in Togo; African Queen, about the campaign of Van Lettow-Vorbeck in the Great Lakes. Yet another movie you might add to your list is Out of Africa, set in Kenya during World War I. Plenty of romance, flying, Mozart, and a dash of syphilis.
Thank you.
Another great movie, this one set on the French Western Front in 1916, was Paths of Glory by Stanley Kubrick, my favorite director, with my favorite actor, Kirk Douglas, in it.
Ready to kill more Germans? Yes, sir. Working over your rifle, I see. Well, that's the way. It's a soldier's best friend. You be good to it, and it'll always be good to you. Yes, sir.
Well, that's it for today. Peace at last, and plenty of movies to watch.